Your generous support makes this ministry possible. Thank you.
We are changing discussions once again, to eating disorders. I want to discuss this. We're going to spend today and Thursday looking at this issue. Most of today we're going to be looking at a video. Again, videos aren't always my only way of discussing these issues, but I do think there's a lot of good material out there. That's why I want to show you. And then have a discussion lecture on Thursday as we discuss it. But before we get into that, can I get you to give me some help as to, first off, why do you think people struggle with eating disorders? As you've looked at it, just by a show of hands, does anyone either know of someone that's struggled with it or had someone in the family? Okay, I mean, all of us pretty much, okay. Give me some ideas. Why do you think generally people struggle with eating disorders? What are some of the reasons? Pardon me?
Because food is so good.
Food is so good. Amen. Sometimes I say that a little too often. I go for seconds and thirds and eighths and things like that. You had one.
I feel like eating disorders are stem from other issues.
Such as?
Like either depression or
Okay.
self-esteem issues, things like that.
That they're just they're the symptoms of a bigger issue. So it's not just dealing with the eating disorder, but we need to deal with the bigger issue behind it as well. Okay, good.
I think it has a lot to do with self-value and self-identity.
Okay. Can you explain your understanding between those two ideas of value and identity?
I guess they're pretty similar, but
Okay.
just how much worth you are, and then who you are,
Okay.
what your label is.
And so explain that in the mind of someone who struggles with an eating disorder. Kind of getting to what Beck was saying, they do the eating thing, disorder, because of what faulty perception would you say?
Because they society and everywhere surrounding you say you have to be pretty
Okay.
if you're going to be worsening for girls,
So again,
and you have to be super strong and fit.
so in some ways, it's not just their own estimation of value and idea, but it's imposed values by society, culture, family, perhaps even as well, that's trying to say this is how you should look, so therefore, one ways of regulating that is through an eating disorder, okay? Yeah?
I know specifically that it can have something to do with control issues.
Definitely, yeah. What do you mean by that, control issues?
If something in their life, or if their life is a complete mess, there's one thing that they feel that they can control, and that's food.
Generally speaking, what type of personalities do you find with people that struggle with eating disorders? Does anyone know? Generally speaking?
Is it kind of more social, outgoing kind of stuff?
Yeah, they're usually very, I guess you could say social.
They have
Interact.
schedules and stuff like that.
And why do they have such busy schedules?
Because
What type of person are they?
Are they micromanagers?
Micromanagers? Give me some other ways of describing these people.
Type A personality.
Type A, which means what?
They're very outgoing, very influential.
Very driven, very, very, very organized, usually very kind of take charge of life, right? Generally speaking, now that's not to say there aren't some people that are a little more type B personality, more the laid back, kind of easygoing. But generally speaking, people that have some type of eating disorder are very high energy, very socially outgoing, very domineering, aggressive type people that like to take control of their world rather than just kind of waiting and being very laid back, very aggressive in that manner. And so in some ways it's understandable that they want to take control of that aspect, that specific aspect of their physical appearance. In fact, what I'll do on Thursday is also, I think I mentioned to some of you, I just finished writing an article on a theology of the body, because this definitely gets into play with how it is we as Christians deal with our bodies, how it is that we understand that this is God's body and what He wants to do with it, and it definitely plays into this idea of image, how we view ourselves, how we actually deal with ourselves. But nevertheless, as by a show of your own hands, this is definitely an unfortunate and growing issue. Just read an article of late that on Facebook, there are actually what's known as pro-anorexia groups that are actually growing on Facebook. Before, it used to be a very somewhat covert group of people that would, swap ways of which to cover your anorexia or ways of, shedding on pounds, it was kind of kept on the down low. Now it's actually becoming in vogue to admit it, to share with others. Oh, how do you binge and how do you diet and how do you use laxatives? And they're actually encouraging people. Facebook is obviously trying to close down these groups, knowing that they're, one, against their user policies, but two, they're just very unethical. For people to be encouraging other people to engage in this type of behavior is just very wrong. This was just last week that I was reading this article about it. But the idea is that it's gaining acceptance again, that who are you to tell me that I can't do this to my body? It's my body. I'll do with it as I want. You eat too much cake, I'll eat the cake and then throw it up. Who's to say one's right and one's wrong? Is the argument that a lot of people are giving. And there's this rationalization that's coming along, especially within youth groups, within high school students, that you guys need to be aware of, need to know the warning signs and not much more of how to deal with it. This is an issue that we even deal with here within this college. Almost every year we have people that are dealing with this struggle, mainly women, but we're also seeing guys as well. Interestingly enough, do you know where guys specifically struggle with eating disorders and weight issues? Sports in general, specific sports like wrestling, where weight is such a determinant of what class they get into and what things. But we are seeing more within, away from sports, similar to women, in just terms of the physical appearance, the presentation that they want to give to people, how they look. So therefore, they're willing to go to extreme ways of dealing with it, such as eating disorders. Generally speaking, do you know the difference between the eating disorders of something like anorexia and bulimia? And we'll talk more about this on Thursday, but just to give you an idea when you hear the terms.
Anorexia, you don't eat anything.
Right.
Bulimia, you binge and purge.
Right. And the idea of anorexia, you just withdraw from food, very limited. Bulimia, you take it in, sometimes in enormous amounts, but then you either force your fingers down your throat and make yourself throw up, or you take laxatives, in which you then use the bathroom quite often. Other issues in that of overeating, binge eating definitely fall into that, but the two main ones that you'll hear about in this video are anorexia nervosa and bulimia as well. Clinically speaking, they're classified as anxiety disorders, so this is actually somewhat of a continuation of our discussion last week as well. People that get so worked up about how they look and how they project themselves that they go to these very disordered ways of dealing with it, specifically in food and their appearance. But we started last Tuesday discussing or looking at that video from, looking at that video on eating disorders. I asked you a little bit. Again, I think most of us have known people that struggle with eating disorders, seeing some of the realities that play into that as well. So to try and get our thoughts thinking, I showed you that video, wanted to then follow up today with some of the things to be looking for. First off, what are some of the warning signs? Like anything else, you need to be aware of what it looks like, what it is somebody that may be dealing with a disorder. You're curious enough, so you're observing enough, so you can start making some questions. First off, weight loss is obviously a big part of it. The intent to lose the amount of weight in a relatively short period of time. Extreme thinness or loss of 15 or more pounds in 2 to 3 months is accelerated by weight loss. Now again, that's obviously a big part of this. They want to avoid weight gain, and so an extreme form of that, extreme thinness, I mean just visibly looking at a person. Like all the other issues that we've talked about before, if you start just seeing one of these issues, do not automatically assume, oh, you're really thin, you must have an eating disorder. Don't jump to that conclusion. What you always need to see, like other things, is a confluence, numerous red flags, which then may lead to you having a concern and bringing that up to the person's attention. So just because a person's thin does not automatically mean they have an eating disorder, right? But with other things, Tense fear of being overweight. Preoccupied with thinness, wants to be thinner than peers, complains of being overweight when not obsessed with clothing, size, scales, and mirrors. If you remember the video from Tuesday, do you remember how they always stepped onto the scales when they were with therapists and workers? Backwards. Why is that? In fact, one of the women, that older woman who was walking with a walker, she used to be a ballet dancer, she said it well, is that the scale was her idol. It was her altar that she went to every morning, praying and hoping it would give her the answer she wanted. So one of the things they actually do in therapy is they make them actually step onto it backwards so they are not so preoccupied. And they need to get their weight, but they want to go against what they've been doing naturally all of this time. That scale validates them, gives them the information they want, or doesn't, and so they go to these extreme forms. If you hear a person that is so obsessed with their appearance, with their thinness, and again, especially with a lot of the population you guys are going to be working with youth, I mean, tell me how many kids in your youth group aren't obsessed with their looks, right? Aren't obsessed with how they look and how they present themselves. I mean, that's quite normative, I realize already. What we're saying is even more so, they're obsessed with how they look, especially as it relates to their weight. Not just their hair color, not just their complexion, but specifically as it relates to their weight. Micah?
Do they then tell them what their weight is? Like, are they conscious of their weight when they're going through therapy, or do they know?
It depends where they're at. Usually when they're starting, no. They might say, okay, listen, we need to get a couple more weights here, a couple more weights there. They're very intentional of not letting the number being the determinant. They want overall health to be the determinant. And so the person may step onto the scale and say, okay, you can get down. And I guarantee you, what's that person who just stepped on the scale want? They want the information, right? More often than not, the therapist won't give it to them.
They're trying to usually gain weight.
Yeah, right.
So the idea of them gaining weight will probably freak them out even.
That much more. Oh, 2 pounds. And so that much more, if anything, they're just going to get the information, and then the therapist, the dietitian, the team then uses that information as needed. Later, they might get them involved in it once they've started dealing with some of the issues of why they got there, so they can integrate that, because that's something they're going to have to do later in life. They can't walk up on a scale and then hopefully know the number. They got to look at it at some point in life, right? When they first start off, that's usually not the case. Yeah. So an intense fear of being overweight is really what we're looking at. Not just, again, their complexion, their clothing, but specifically as it relates to their weight. Preoccupation with dieting and food. Again, obviously because that's in direct correlation to weight gain or weight loss. Uses diet products, talks constantly about food, calories, fat grams, reads a lot about nutrition, dieting, and exercise. I mean, again, it's quite normative for especially the population that many of you will be working with in youth, for them to be thinking and talking about this stuff. What we're looking for is an overemphasis on these areas, almost just weird amount of information that they're always talking about fat grams and caloric intake and all the issues that go into that. Because they've obviously been studying enough about it, so then to how to deal with it. It's almost a little too much information. Again, it's really interesting because I see so many correlations to, like, when someone's talking about somebody who's struggling with pornography, when they have an inordinate amount of information regarding that topic, that can be a sign that they're engaged in a very unhealthy way. When someone who's dealing with pornography has too much information about sexuality in general, that can be an indication that they're struggling with it. Much like this, when they have almost too much information about calories, fat grams, nutrition areas, especially for a kid who's in high school, it's not usually what kids in high school talk about, right? So if that starts coming up, that can be a red flag for you in some ways. Some other warning signs: eating little, skips meals, eats very little, is finicky about food, appears to eat when not, pushes food around on a plate, but mostly does not eat it. Again, this is more of an observational reality, that you're actually watching them, seeing. And again, if you see it one time, obviously that's not the end of the world, right? I mean, that's not, you didn't finish your French fries, you must have an eating disorder. No, you're looking for that over a period of time, that meal after meal after meal, they take very little portions. And again, remember, what type of personality are we dealing with, generally speaking, with people that, pardon me?
The A-type personality.
Very controlling, very aggressive, very A-type personality. And so they are very much into portion control, right? Very much into, okay, I can only eat this and this. And they might even go as extreme. These trays that we have in the dining hall now that are very compartmentalized, they love that. because it keeps their food very organized and very separated as needed compared to the one plate. This might touch this and that'll touch that. Ooh, I don't want to get into that. I mean, this fits perfect. We're helping the obsessive compulsives in our dining hall, just so you know. They like to keep that. And so what you're looking for is specifically some of these ideas of very limited food, very fussy in terms of the choice of food, or they try to almost trick people into thinking they're eating a lot. I used to do this when I was a kid all the time, right? If I didn't like something, I would just like push it into the corner and like kind of like pile it up to make it look like I ate it. Because when it was first put on my plate, it'd be spread out. Oh, it looks like a lot of food. If I just kind of, put it in one pile, then it looks like I ate some. And I don't know if you guys did. I was a weird kid that much, I guess. You try to like fool people into thinking that you've eaten it when you really haven't. You just kind of pushed it to the side. Again, if you see that once, maybe not a concern, but if you continue to see a lot of these actions as it relates to how they eat their food, again, that can be a concern. Unusual eating habits. Eats one thing at a time, eats the same thing every day, cuts food into tiny pieces, fears touching certain foods, sudden vegetarianism, refuses to eat with others. I mean, all this, again, relating to how they eat. Specifically, very controlled, very prescribed in terms of their attitudes of how then they eat, what they eat, how often they eat. Again, because we're dealing with that very, very rigid personality, very type A. They're going to be very controlled, even in how they eat, where they eat, who they eat with.
With all the control, I don't know, with it becoming more, like you were talking about there being Facebook groups, as becoming more and more acceptable. Do you find they're coming up with ways of like supplementing? Like if they're not going to eat fats and stuff, they're not getting their calcium. Are they, not taking a lot more supplements and stuff like that? Could that be?
So as not to gain weight but still get the nutrients? Yeah. It's a good question. The ones that I've seen, and we'll talk a little bit, this is called pro-anorexic groups and things like that. More often than not, they're not giving them advice of how to supplement. They're just giving them advice of how to do it. They don't have enough forethought most often to think that, say, well, you still do need calcium. You still do need some type of protein. So here's another way to get it without getting the weight. They're mainly concerned just with the here and now. Here's how to lose weight. And so, again, not that we would advocate it, but we would almost wish they would do it, right? That you'd still get the nutrients you need, even if you don't want the fat. But nevertheless, their motivation behind it is still problematic.
Don't you still need fat molecules for the calcium to bind to?
Oh, definitely. We're not arguing that they need to do this. Understand, right?
But I'm just saying, like, even if they supplement calcium, they need the fat molecules for.
We're not denying that. We're not denying that at all. The point that we're saying is that they're not even willing to think that engaged to begin with, because they're just thinking of the here and now. If I just lose the pounds, then I'll be pretty. That's really what it comes down to, right? Now, again, why they're there is a combination of a number of factors, but they're not willing to think that holistically, healthy, and obviously still missing out on a number of other factors as well, that it's not just get rid of fat and you're okay. No, actually you need fat in your life as well. We're so fat conscious within our culture, we think that getting rid of it is the answer to everything, which actually can make you worse off in a lot of ways as well, so we need to be careful. Some other warning signs. Bathroom breaks, disappears into the bathroom during or after meals, may suggest vomiting to purge those calories. Again, someone gets up, says, I got to go to the bathroom. Don't then all of a sudden assume, that person has an eating disorder. Maybe, maybe not. But if you see this frequently, that can be a concern. Taking up smoking. Why would smoking, do you think, be a connection as a warning sign? Yeah.
Because it curbs hunger.
Totally does. In fact, if you know anyone that's tried to stop smoking, what usually ends up happening? Huge weight gain. I had a teacher of mine in junior high. I saw a picture of him like when he was like in his 20s and 30s, skinny as a rail, because as a teacher for me, he was like 300 plus pounds. I'm like, what in the world happened to you? I mean, I didn't have a lot of discernment in junior high. So I asked him that question, what in the world happened to you? I quit smoking. Whoa, what'd they put in those cigarettes, right? And it really does. The nicotine acts as an inhibitor to hunger. And so they know this, they'll smoke more, obviously increasing so many other problems, but nevertheless, it's to curb the appetite in a very direct way.
I had a friend back home that she's like, yeah, I need to quit smoking, but that means I would get really fat. I don't want to be fat.
Yeah.
I'm going to keep smoking.
And so they'd rather have the effects of heart disease and lung disease rather than look bad. I'm like, oh, great, so just kill your insides rather than, yeah, wonderful. Caffeine use, excessive drinking of diet, caffeinated beverages, or regular coffee without sugar, obviously because you don't want to add those caloric intake. But again, it's a stimulant. It gets your body moving. And I mean, that much more, not just caffeine in coffee, but what are some of the more recent caffeinated beverages that you know of? Energy drinks in general. I mean, these things are horrific. And now, luckily, thankfully, terribly, we have diet energy drinks, right? So all the energy without any of the sugar. I mean, the whole point. And so that much more, I mean, they're downing these Red Bulls and these Monster energy drinks in crazy amounts in order to at least get some energy, which is helping for the now maybe in their mind, but making things actually a lot worse. Evidence of binge eating. A lot of empty food packages may suggest binging. So this gets more to the bulimic side where a person eats so much more. And that one part of the video I thought was interesting where they brought in, that woman was rolling in all the food, the Oreos and the bags of chips. Do you remember that scene? And essentially what happened with the people? How much food were they eating?
Too much.
Like 2 days worth of food in one sitting. And they started doing the research on that woman that was sitting on the chair on her stomach, and she had to drink that drink. And they started seeing the stomach in terms of how it was letting the food out into the intestines and things like that. For someone that is in continued binged eating and purging, they essentially are limiting the proper the food disseminating into the intestines. That they're not getting the sense. The hormones aren't setting the sense of you're full, you're done. And essentially they've changed the makeup of their body in such a way by doing this repeatedly over and over that they lose. You guys know what that feels like, right? Like when you've eaten enough, you're like, oh, I'm full, I can't have another bite. Last night I took my wife, because she's been going stir crazy, I took her out while Grandma was watching the kids. I took her out to that new restaurant, Huhat, out in the mall, that Mongolian grill. I had a bowl, and I was like, oh, I'm going to get one more bowl. And I had 2 bowls of food. I was done. People like this, they would have excess of 4 or 5 bowls. But to them, it doesn't matter how many they have because it's all going to be divulged anyway. And so they're actually changing. And it's so interesting. We're going to see some of the effects of this later, too. Not just psychologically and emotionally and spiritually, but physically, what they're doing. This is why, I don't know if you heard it earlier in the video, eating disorders are the most deadly mental illness. Physically deadly. Because of the physical effects it has. Karen Carpenter, they talked about that woman, that singer. She died in her, was it her 20s, early 30s. The ballerina that they mentioned before when she was in her 20s. I mean, it is the most deadly mental illness because of the physiological effects, mainly leading to heart failure. I mean, the body just shuts down eventually, and that's why it's so incredibly dangerous. So important that we help people that are dealing with this as quickly as possible. Other warning signs, empty laxative packages, herbal or otherwise, may suggest purging. Onset of hyperactivity, constantly fidgets, lots of exercise, again, just more so than usual for a person. Loss of menstrual period, obviously for females, if you remember, they actually talked about this as well, that the ongoing effects of excessive anorexia or bulimia or dieting or laxatives, it actually has a physiological change in women, that they actually stop producing estrogen, which is in connection to menstrual periods, and that is actually one of the biggest indicators. Now again, it's not like something that you have conversation about, right? It's not something that you talk in normal everyday conversation, but if you start seeing some of these questions, and I will say I've done this in counseling, and I usually warn the female ahead of time, listen, I'm going to ask you some personal questions here. I'm not trying to be getting into your personal life unnecessarily, but it does help me know how serious this is. And then I will ask her, when's the last time you had a period? And when they tell me that they have very irregular periods, or they have very infrequent, or they haven't had one in a long time, that to me is that much more ratcheting up the reality of this person having an eating disorder. You want to be sensitive, but you need to ask the question as well in a very sensitive manner. All right? It's a personal issue, I realize, but it gives you that much more of an indication of the problems that are going on here. Intolerance of cold, shivering, blue skin, or fingers. Interestingly enough, why do you think this person is that much more sensitive to cold?
They don't have any fat on their bodies.
To be one, right? In fact, it's interesting. You know what the body then will do to compensate a lot of times for lack of fat and the regulation of heat?
starts breaking down your muscle.
Muscle tone definitely starts going at that point, but especially for women. Now, obviously, in our society, hair on women is not too attractive, and they don't like that. But interestingly enough, you'll see actually an increase. The body actually tries to compensate for the lack of fat and the warmth by actually growing hair on the face, on the arms, on the back. I mean, I know it sounds almost disgusting, but it's your body's defense in actually trying to preserve itself. The body's saying, what are you doing? I got to ratchet up some other ways of preserving heat. And so when you see this oversensitivity to cold, again, there are always people that are always sensitive to cold. I'm saying when this seems to be more so in conjunction with some other warning signs. I mean, talk about how wonderfully and fearfully we're made that the body just automatically does this as a means of trying to protect itself. It's just amazing to me. But nevertheless, can be, again, a warning sign of someone that may be struggling with an eating disorder. Baggy or full covering clothes, whereas baggy clothes, long sleeve pants, coats during the summer months. In fact, no, that was actually another thing, but you'll remember, just again, that they don't want to be able to show themselves. The first image of that girl who was painting on the mirror, do you remember that at the very beginning of the video? And they did, I think they produced it very well. They essentially do a shot of the camera from her legs up while she's saying how she feels about herself. Do you remember what she said about herself? I feel fat, I feel ugly, I feel overweight. And as the camera is panning up, what are you seeing? She was a stick, right? I'm fat, I'm ugly. I'm like, I mean, they really, truly think that. Obviously, it's not right, but that much more, they want to hide it, they want to keep it under wraps. I mean, if that starts coming up, you need to start getting concerned. Skin and hair problems, pasty-looking skin, and this is getting to the hair loss as well. Growth on the face and arms like a baby, very fine hair. So the hair usually on the head will become very brittle and dry for lack of nutrients, and then this baby hair kind of starts growing in other places. All indicators of malnourishment. Swollen salivary glands, distended chipmunk cheeks, kind of like right underneath there where all of a sudden, again, it's not normative for them to have that look about them. That can start coming up as well. Broken blood vessels in the eyes, obviously change in mood, anxious, depressed, irritable, increased obsessions and compulsions. Again, eating disorders, clinically speaking, are classified under anxiety disorders. Meaning, again, because they have a certain way of approaching life, they are usually more high-strung, usually very high-functioning, very type A personalities. If you're seeing that develop in other ways as well, not just with food, but in life in general, where all of a sudden you start seeing problems in relationships, you start seeing problems in school, in ministry, in life in general, again, that can be a very clear warning sign that this may be an area they're dealing with. All right? Yeah?
What's the broken blood vessels in that?
In the eyes? You'll often see, it's not just a redness, but there's actually, I mean, it's a pronounced specific area of the eye that looks like it's bloodshot. But like when you think of bloodshot eyes, usually the whole eye is red. It's usually very pinpointed, like right in the corner or right in the corner where you see like a specific area that looks like it's bloodshot. But it's actually blood vessels that are breaking because of lack of nutrition and things like that in the body as well. And one of the areas that comes out is actually within the eyes. Yeah. And you'll see that with other issues like jaundice as well. You see that usually through the eyes. It's because of the body's inability, with jaundice at least, to deal with certain metabolisms and things like that as well. Yeah. Social withdrawal, perfectionistic, low self-esteem, obviously are other indicators, that much more. The social withdrawal, especially with somebody who is very high-functioning, type A personality, if they're all of a sudden, they usually do very well in social situations, right? But if all of a sudden they're starting to withdraw from that, obviously that's going to be an indicator, a warning sign that you need to consider. Perfectionistic, low self-esteem, obviously they're feeling very bad about themselves, so we need to kind of appreciate that much more. Expects too much of self and sees self as not good enough. Some of the health problems with anorexia. Talked about this before, but understand this is a very, very serious. I talked about suicide before, and I said, listen, we need to always consider it serious because we need to ensure the safety of that person. If I can be honest, in terms of the many different issues that you may deal with, I would put eating disorders right underneath suicidal ideation. It's just that serious. Now, I may not have to get the person into an ER right then, but I do need to follow up very quickly to ensure the physical safety of that person as soon as possible. Because if I don't deal with the physical safety, then there's no use of trying to deal with the spiritual, emotional issues that are underlying that. Does that make sense? Kind of like depression. I got to deal with a physical reality first to ensure that, so then I can deal with the spiritual and emotional issues underlying that. That's just how serious this is. A person with anorexia starves herself to dangerously thin levels, at least 15% below what would be considered normal body weight. Again, I'm not asking you to go around with a BMI index in your back pocket. You guys know what a BMI is, body mass index, and it's kind of a new way of assessing your height and your weight and determining what's healthy. I'm not saying you have to memorize that. And let me just pull my chart out and see if you have a proper. That's not what I'm asking, but you got to understand how serious this is. Some of the medical impacts of anorexia. We've talked about loss of menstrual cycle. It's known as amenorrhea. I'm not saying that properly, but I'm not a doctor, nor do I play one on TV. Nevertheless, this is a very serious, and usually occurs with all women who are anorexic. Again, just because the nutrition is being starved from the woman's body, it is going to shut down the reproductive capacity. And again, some women, I've talked to some women who deal with anorexia and say, this is great. Not only do I look good, but I don't have to deal with a period. I'm not moody, I'm not irritable, I don't have to deal with that. And I'm saying, yeah, but you are doing irrevocable damage. You may think it's okay now, but there may be coming a time when you cannot have any children ever. And so they have to realize that this is a very serious indication of how problematic their eating disorder is. Anemia, without sufficient nutrition, blood is affected and anemia results. Again, just the lack of energy that usually is accompanied with this, the problem that goes with it. Fortunately, this condition is only temporary. Blood health returns once food is reintroduced. Essentially, we're dealing with the blood at this point. It's how your body transports all that nutrition. It can be a very problematic reality. Dry skin and hair loss. Dehydration causes the skin to drastically dry out and become flaky. Scalp is starved for protein. You'll see, again, this problem as it relates to the hair on them becomes worse. And then there's this other fine, like baby hair that starts growing in other places as well. Again, just to see how the body tries to compensate for these problems. We talked about feeling cold. This other one, slowness of thought. Literal, in extreme cases of eating disorders, there is what's known as a brain shrinkage. Again, it makes sense. There is a lack of proper nutrition to the body, and one of the problem areas that is actually the brain. Your brain needs food. Go figure. It needs specific food, proteins and fats and caloric intake to be able to be healthy and nutritious. So obviously, if you're starting to see certain slowness in cognitive abilities, to see that it may be temporary, but there can be significant impact. You don't, as far as I understand, you don't regrow brain cells, right? There's a lot of other cells that do replenish, and if I cut myself, my skin cells can grow back. Brain cells aren't one of them. You got what you got, and you doing what you're doing to them is not going to bring anything back, right? So there can be a real significant relation to cognitive abilities in people that are dealing with this as well. Osteopenia, osteoporosis, essentially bone damage, right? Again, remember that woman who was walking with the walker. A woman who could do incredible flexible things. When I was watching those ballerinas and she did that one thing with the leg where it was like up here, I was like, oh, that looks painful. But she can do it. She's that flexible, right? And that woman used to be able to do that. And now I felt almost fearful for her in that video when she was like crossing the street. Do you remember that scene? Where she's like, and I'm like, they're going to start going and they're going to like run her down or something. I'm like, come on, get going. That's as literal as fast as she can go. I don't know if you remember the body image, the bone density scan they did of a healthy 20-year-old woman, and then a woman of the same age who had been having an eating disorder for 5 years and how much lack of bone density, and then another woman of 10 years, that she had the bone density at 20 years old of a woman in her 70s. That is incredible, that over that small period of time, she can have that much of a damage within her body and her skeletal system specifically. Obviously, this is a huge concern. heart rhythm abnormalities, and eventually heart attacks. This is usually how fatal it becomes, is usually through some heart issues. Again, continued lack of nutrition, essentially you're going to affect your heart, and your heart's just going to stop. I mean, for a 30-year-old woman to die of a heart attack, it's not normative. Obviously, that's a huge, huge concern. Electrolyte abnormalities, starving itself, obviously the muscle tissue and the heart, all these things are drastically affected, all for the desire of looking thin. They think it helps on the outside, but they cannot begin. The way that one woman said, you don't hear the cash register when you're doing it, but it's ringing for me now. It's now that I know the effects of what I was doing then, that much more. With bulimia, which is, again, the eating and the purging, other health problems such as injury to the esophagus. And understand, you know where your esophagus, right? It's where you swallow all the food down. Why do you think there's damage to the esophagus with you throwing it up? That much more, right? You have all these acids that are in your stomach that are supposed to stay in your stomach. Your stomach is a wonderful organ that God designed to have these certain linings around it that are purposely designed to keep the acids there. They aren't supposed to be in other places in your body, namely your esophagus, which I'm sure all of us have thrown up at some time in our life, legitimately over some sickness. And you know the feeling in your mouth, right? And just the burning sensation, and just talking about it makes you want to gag right now, right? I understand. If I hear it, though, I do that little dry heave number, and it's not a good thing for me. And so that much more, I personally can't imagine someone willingly wanting to engage in vomiting. To me, it's just such a disgusting thing, but it gives you an indication of how severe, how abnormal their thinking is. Can I say it that way? That for them to do this routinely after every meal, what I consider to be incredibly disgusting and painful, they also know it to be disgusting and painful, but they think it's worth it to be thin. It tells you how disillusioned their thinking is at this point, right? Eventually can have real problems in tearing the esophagus, the lining of it. I mean, some very problematic realities. Injury to the stomach, injury to the intestines. Binge eating and frequent vomiting commonly causes gastritis and inflammation of the stomach lining. Again, if you remember those times that you've thrown up, how your gut feels, right? I mean, it feels like someone's just socked you in the gut because you're doing something to your stomach that's not native to your stomach. You're not supposed to do that. That heaving, it's not normative for food to come out of your stomach that direction. It's supposed to go the other direction. So that much more, you're going to have problems. Injury to the intestines. Laxative abuse especially brings this upon. Again, laxatives are needed sometimes, especially for incontinence and times when you need them. But continual use of laxatives obviously is going to have huge problems to the digestive tract, burns out the colon, damage to the muscle and nerves, often causes severe constipation. I mean, the problems obviously are huge. Lung damage. Self-induced vomiting leads to aspiration of food particles and acid into the lungs. Again, food's not meant to come up that way. It may happen because of flu or illness, but if you do it continually over and over and over and over again, there's going to be major issues within that. Severe kidney and heart complications. Yeah?
These, with all these causes, does your body rebuild and refix these, or are they lifelong?
It depends. If caught quickly enough, then yeah, there's mostly a good chance that there can be some good reparative work that's done. If a person does this prolonged, like with some of the issues with like bone issues, there's little that can be done with that. With some of the more internal organs, usually if given time and proper medication and nutrition, yeah, they can have some rebuilding and refunctioning and things like that. If it's gone on for a long time, though, you may have to deal, like if there's continued damage to the esophagus and things like that, without any proper nutrition and that constant acid reflux and things like that, there can be irreparable damage done at that point, where no amount of nutrition and proper eating was going to repair it at that point. If caught quickly enough, yeah. If done long enough, probably not. Yeah. Ben?
So in the video, I was talking about a girl who was bulimic, that she would go up to what, 20 times?
20 times a day.
How is that possible? I mean, like, is it eating 3 meals and just like multiple throw-ups to get it all out, or like?
Yeah, to tell you the truth, I don't know, to be honest, but yeah, it's as many times as she feels it necessary to get rid of the food. Maybe thinking that one time wasn't enough. And so I know I ate more than what I just gave, and so she does it multiple times. So if you consider she has 3 meals a day, and she does it maybe 3 times after each meal. So that's 9 right there, and then consider if she has, and again, realize more often than not, they're eating more than the average person does at one sitting, right? So they may have to do it even more, 4 or 5 times to get even more of the food out. And so that much more if they have snacks, because again, they're eating more throughout the day than the average person does. So they may not just have the 3 meals, they may have multiple snacks. Again, in their mind, it doesn't matter how much I eat. Why? Well, I'm going to be throwing it up anyway. And so consider how many snacks and meals you have throughout a day. Consider you may not get it all out the first time you do it, so that you can understand why there's these multiple, I mean, 20 times a day. That's more on the extreme side, I realize. But again, it just shows you how bad it can get for some people.
And I didn't quite understand like the high thing, like how it's a high for them.
Yeah, again, not that I understand it either, but I think more so in terms of how they feel when they do it. They feel empowered. They feel they're in control at this point. They realize I can eat whatever I want, and I'm not gaining a pound. And there's a euphoria that comes with that knowledge. Obviously, it's an incredibly abnormal, disfocused reality, but nevertheless, they feel that euphoria because of it.
So that might add the amount they throw up because
they feel good about it. Yeah, they're doing what they want to do, not gain weight and look good.
Would it be possible that they also are getting kind of a sugar high too?
I don't know any of that stuff. There may be some physiological reactions to that as well. I'm not aware of that. Yeah. Do you have a question? Okay. Injury to skin and teeth. Again, with the amount of vomiting and the amount of gastric acid, you can understand it's going to start dealing with the enamel of the teeth. Literally, you'll also see the discoloration in nails as well. Mainly because, again, they're sticking their fingers down their mouth, and it's coming up even on you'll see brittling of the nails and fingertips, yellowing and things like that as well.
That eventually you don't need to stick your fingers down your mouth anymore, that you can just throw up.
Really? Okay. I haven't heard that you can just do it voluntarily without the exercise of something. Interesting.
Exercise like a reflex.
So well, they just know how to do it. So causes. Why does a person do what they do? If you're seeing some of the warning signs, some of the things, whether it be anorexic or bulimia, we've talked about this already. Highly motivated individual. In fact, let me first do this. Excuse me. This is a 4. Who are we missing today? Heidi. This is a checklist for both the visible and behavioral signs for anorexia on the front, bulimia on the back. So just to complement some of what we've just went through already. But when it comes to personalities, interestingly enough, obviously one of the first issues is the personality. We've talked about this already. Very type A personality, very driven, very motivated, usually has things, usually a little more high-end stressed person, a little more high-end anxious, but that anxiety, in their opinion, helps and enables them to get all the things done that they want to get done. So obviously this plays into that a lot in terms of the personality. Genetic factors. Now, I don't think there's a lot of research in this area, but there does seem to be a correlation to predispositions. All right? So that's different than meaning you have blue eyes and you have brown and blonde hair, so therefore you will have an eating disorder. I don't want to make it a one-to-one genetic correlation, but I do believe there are what's known as predispositions that are genetically oriented. Doesn't mean a person has to have an eating disorder, but there may be a proclivity because of some realities in their family. I think alcoholism is a similar reality to that. You don't inherit alcoholism, but there may be certain realities in your family that if there's that sustained alcoholism for multiple generations, there is a predisposition Diabetes is another one. You don't inherit diabetes, but the fact that my dad has diabetes, I have, statistically speaking, a 50% chance of developing diabetes myself. I mean, that's just part of the genetic makeup of who I am. Doesn't mean you're going to get it, but there is some predisposition. Do you understand the difference between the two?
Affected and not different.
In some ways, right. That's more on a psychological level. This is more on a genetic level. Yeah, so you are affected, but not, I'm going to use that. I like that. That's good. All right. Environmental factors, pressures from society and expectations from family and friends may lead towards development of eating. I mean, again, you don't have to look too far within our own media, within our own culture, in terms of what is determined healthy, what that looks. I was at a Red Robin restaurant down on 20 a couple of weeks ago. You still working there? Yeah. Oh, okay. There's one of the tables that I sat at, and you know where I'm talking about. The bar is on one side, and then on the other side, they have a kind of that wall. It's got tons of pictures on it. And there are some pictures of Marilyn Monroe. You know which ones I'm talking about? Yeah, they're not the most family-oriented pictures, in my opinion. She's on the beach, and she's wearing, which would be very conservative now, a bathing suit. And I'm not trying to be graphic in saying this, but Marilyn Monroe was not the skinniest woman. She was very, very full in her figure, both in top and bottom. Okay, she was very full in that sense. But I found it so interesting, again, that back then, that was considered beautiful. That image now is considered very, whoa, she's a little overweight. Not a little, but that picture, she's a lot overweight. And how our culture has really changed. I had a friend of mine, my freshman year, he's from Liberia, okay, which is a country in Africa. Very different culture, obviously, right? So one time he went up to this girl, who we were standing in line in the dining hall. I don't know if I've told some of you this story. And he goes up to her and he says, "You are a very fat woman." And now this girl, she really was. I mean, she was a very overweight girl. But do you understand why he said that to her? He was actually complimenting her. Because in his culture, women that are of larger size are actually considered beautiful. That's admired, that's desired within his culture. So he sees this woman who is very overweight, and he sees that and says, wow, she is beautiful. Literally, she's very fat. Now, poor girl, she obviously did not take it that way. Started breaking down right there and ran out. And my friend Yenner, he's sitting there like, what did I say? What did I say? I was trying to compliment her. I'm like, yeah, that's not a compliment in America. But it just gives you an insight of how different the thinking is within our culture. And unfortunately, I do believe this, especially with media and the influence that the American media has within the world, is continuing to have an influence throughout the world. So that even places like Liberia, that idea of beauty as seen with overweightness is not so much considered. And obviously there are spiritual causes. An individual is trying to find meaning and desire of worth outside of themselves. They're seeking enjoyment. And let me say this, I don't think it's wrong to find meaning. You want to find meaning in life? That's good. That's inherent within. Pascal talked about that we are all desiring something greater than ourselves. I think that's good and right. What you find that meaning in is the question, right? And when our culture, when our own sinful selves say that you find meaning on how good you look, we buy into it. And then we do such incredibly damaging things to find that meaning, only to find out that it's just a dead end, right? It's more emptiness and despair rather than help and hope. But nevertheless, there are huge, significant spiritual realities at play here as well. Again, just like I believe suicide has with it some demonic influence, Satan wants to do wonderful, terrible things in terms of the destruction of the body. I believe this has some connection to that as well. I'm not about to say that there's a demon behind every anorexia, but I do believe there's enough demonic oppression in this area. If I can destroy the body, I can destroy the person. Satan wants to do that. He wants to destroy God's creation. So I do believe there is an element of some demonic influence within this issue as well. All right? Just because you see that pattern throughout all of history. How do we help then? How do we deal with people that are going through this? Can I just say as well, this handout that I gave to you on bulimic women in comparison with normal females and the family cycle of bulimic families, read through that. It's really interesting to see some of the family issues. Again, to quote my friend in the back, you are affected, you're not determined by your family. But to see the families of women that struggle with eating disorders is really interesting. Generally speaking, the mothers are very controlling, very openly demeaning of their daughter, very comparison of her to other siblings and things like that. The dad is very rigid, very inflexible, sometimes very withdrawn. Again, to see the impact of family and how it plays out to this person. Whenever I talk to a girl who's dealing with eating disorders, when I ask about their family, almost 99% of the time that list correlates to their reality. That they have a very inflexible, intolerant mother, very demanding, very controlling, and therefore it plays that out, compares her openly. I had this one girl who said to me, my mom is always comparing me to my sister, openly. Why can't you be more like her? Why can't you act more like her? That's going to have an effect on a little girl, especially as it relates to her physical appearance, right? Why can't you look more like her? Why can't you be as pretty as... I mean, they'll literally say that out loud. I mean, that is going to have a huge effect on a little girl. Nevertheless, way to deal with it. Know the warning signs. Guys, you need to know the warning signs, and you need to ask the questions. Again, you're going to be on the front lines of ministry, especially within youth work, within camp work, within the opportunities of dealing with young men and women specifically, that you need to know what to look for. You've been given the warning signs. Eating disorders are most successfully treated when diagnosed early. If you suspect something, ask. Again, if you see one of these issues, it may not be, but if you start seeing multiple warning signs, just like depression and suicide, guys, you need to ask the question. You may be wrong, but I'd rather you ask and be wrong than not ask and be found right. Right? I'd rather you ask and be found wrong rather than you not ask and be found right. It's just that serious. So if you start seeing a lot of these warning signs, you need to pull that person aside and say, listen, I care for you too much not to ask this question, but I'm seeing a lot of concerning things. I need to ask you, are you struggling with overeating, binging, purging, lack of eating? I mean, use the technical terms if you want. Most people know them, have anorexia and bulimia. But ask in whatever way you can and ask very clearly. Involve family and or close friends. Like most other issues, there is a realization of family having an impact, even more so with eating disorders. The family needs to be involved because it's not just this person that got that way by themselves. As I mentioned with the families, oftentimes you have to deal with the family as well as the individual. Helping the mom say, listen, when you openly compare your daughter to other people, that's not helping. In fact, you openly criticizing them, constantly demanding so much of them, being very critical of them, you've got to change your attitude. Do you want the best for your kid? Yeah. But how you present that is having a negative impact on your child. So there, of necessity, needs to be a change in the family as much as in the kid. Because if you help the kid, but then you just throw them back in the family, you're not really helping them, are you? And so there needs to be an engagement with the family as well. One of the things I often do, and as quickly as possible, is get that young lady to go see a physician as soon as possible. They need a full physical examination. Again, understand how I treat this. Suicidal ideation is very serious. Get them into a doctor, an ER room as soon as possible. I put right underneath that eating disorders because of the physical reality and the consequences of them within the body is just that serious that they need to be checked out by a physician as soon as possible.
What if they occasionally deal with bulimia? Like they say, like I had a friend who was like, I deal with it every once in a while, but it's not really a habit.
Yeah.
Still deal with it the same way? Or you like,
Two things. Yeah, I would deal with it the same way, meaning I would get them to see a physician as soon as possible. And secondly, that's their opinion of it. More often than not, it's less than the reality. Meaning what they think is, I just occasionally do it. More likely than not, they actually do it too much. There's no such thing as a good amount of bulimia, right? And so even if they, in their assessment, saying, well, I just do it occasionally, that's still too much. And so as such, we need to clearly let them know that's not acceptable at all. First thing, let's get you checked out by a doctor. Even if you think you're not doing a lot, that it's having an effect, most likely it is, and you're just not aware of it right now. And so that much more, we need to push them to get a physical checkup. Yeah. So understand those two realities. One, that, yeah, they still do need a physical checkup because they may not know it, even though they don't feel it. But two, realize we don't want to validate even a little bulimia that much more. Yeah. It's a good question, though. Yeah.
I know in counseling foundations, we talked about referring someone to the doctor, making sure the doctor knows why they're there.
Yep.
So like, they say they went to a physician, you know, but that physician didn't know that they're struggling with bulimia, they're not going to check certain things.
Sure.
So making sure that
Yeah, and that's part of what you can do with them, or what I try to do is that much more engagement with the family. So letting the family know, listen, this is the situation here. You need to take your daughter to go in and check in specifically for this. So that much more I want to engage the family. If family's not an option, then that much more, yeah, I'll be part of that process as well. You're absolutely right. So the doctor knows to check for specific areas of concern in relation to this. Micah?
Is there any differences between the way you would treat women struggling with it and treat men?
In these first issues, not so much. Okay. I think when we get to some of the more causation of it, or in terms of the reasons why people do it, like for women, more often than not, it's a physical appearance and trying to find value. For guys that struggle with it, if you remember they were talking, the first concerns are mainly sports, right? Jockeys, weightlifting, wrestling, usually you'll see it in that. But there is a growing reality with appearance as a projection of self and the desire to look good. That is becoming, and she said, yeah, guys need to have the, that that six-pack ab, and they have to have that nice V figure and things like that. I'm kind of working more on the keg myself these days, but the reality is that's becoming more of a concern for guys, right? That's becoming more of a thinking that guys are saying, listen, I have to have a certain body image, therefore I'm going to do with that. So in that sense, it's very similar in dealing with guys as well. They're really coming out of it from a very vanity type of perspective. It's more of the sports. There's still a bit of that even with sports, because a lot of guys find value in sports. So I got to challenge that then as well. Whereas some guys may be finding value in how they look. Well, I got to challenge that, just like women find value in how they look. So the underlying issues may be similar. It's just the way it comes out may be different, and I need to deal with that.
Checking where they find their value.
Exactly, yeah. Other treatment, if you remember also, they talked about in the video, this is not a one-person therapy. You need to most often involve a nutrition, a dietitian, physician, counseling, medication management. There is a multiphased need for help in this area because it deals with so many issues, right? That much more you need that help. And obviously the spiritual care, a deeper dependence on Christ. They need to understand the value. I was just dealing with a student who was dealing with some real big issues of depression and suicidal ideation. And their argument to me is that I've tried all these other things. I've tried God, and he's not good. I'm not finding a lot of depth. And I said to him, listen, the issue is that you've tried God and found him wanting. My opinion is you haven't tried God enough. And that's why you're wanting. That you have not struggled. Is it going to be hard? Is it going to be effort and work? You better believe it is. But is it worth it? Because we live in a society that is so instant that I expect to have enjoyment and joy now. And if I have to work for it, apparently it's not worth it. We have to counter that. That's a spiritual issue of faith. Are you willing to struggle hard knowing that the struggle is bringing you greater joy than anything in this world can? That's a struggle, but it's worth it. I mean, talk to guys who go mountain climbing. I know guys that have done like mountain climbing of huge mountains, like 14ers and higher, things like that. There's the possibility of loss of toes to frostbite, of fingers, of the tips of your nose. I mean, you could die. I know people who have died on the cliffs on the sides of mountains. And part of me thinks, why would you want to climb a mountain knowing the risks? Generally, why do they still do it knowing the risks?
They accomplish it.
They love it. The joy of climbing that mountain, of finding a good foothold, of getting all the way up, of getting to the top and of saying, I got to the... I mean, the joys far outweigh the potential dangers. And this is essentially what we're saying in the fight of faith. There are some potential hurt and problems. You might even die in your pursuit of joy in God, but it's so worth it. There's so much better to be had in a pursuit of God rather than the fleeting pleasures of this world. It's not wrong to want pleasure, in my opinion. I'm showing my Christian hedonism coming out here. I think it's right. I think we're innately built that way. What you find your pleasure in is the question. And what we have to convince people in our culture is it's still going to be work. It's going to be hard, but it's worth it. And don't buy into the lie that the quick answer is the good answer. We live in a consumeristic mentality that I need it now, I want it now, even if I don't have the money, I'll get it now. That unfortunately applies to things like this as well. I can put my fingers down my mouth and get instant results in affirming my value through what I see in the mirror at this point, right? That much more we have to help them fight against that lack of faith, which I really believe is at the end of the day what it is. It's a lack of willing to engage faith. That God, you're better than this, all right? I mentioned this before as well, but family counseling, dealing with some of the expectations and attitudes within the family is also very important. This is not an isolated incident. They are not a victim of their family. They're not that much more found only because of what their family's done, but there are some family dynamics that play into that. I did want to make you aware of one last unfortunate reality. I mentioned this already when we started this discussion, that there are a number of sites, now Facebook groups and other groups that actually encourage the use of anorexia, bulimia, and other eating disorders as a means of a proper lifestyle. Generally known as pro-ana or pro-anorexia. This little article at least gives you some information. I'll at least want you to make aware of this unfortunate reality, that it is becoming more an accepted, who's to say that this is wrong mentality. We can help each other. And so unfortunate because they're helping each other and they know it to be wrong, so one of the things they do is help people learn how to disguise it. How do you hide this from your friends and loved ones? Because they know society doesn't accept it, so therefore we got to keep it under wraps. Well, my thought is, well, if it's so acceptable, then why does it matter what society thinks? I mean, internally, I think they know it to be wrong. So therefore, they try to hide it that much more and justify their actions. This, to me, is a very, very clear indication of how serious this is within our culture, that they're now, again, this is nothing new under the sun, that we are calling what is evil good and good evil. This is an ongoing reality as well. What I'm giving you here is an article from one of the referrals that I usually give to people of a ministry called Remuda Ranch. They're located in Arizona, but it was one of the few Christian counseling centers that deals specifically with eating disorders. That they're going to look at eating disorders. There's a lot of eating disorder clinics, and let me just say, more often than not, I really do believe that people that are seriously struggling with eating disorders really do need to have themselves checked into one of these clinics, that they need around-the-clock team care in order to really effectively deal with this, because it's just that serious. One, physiologically speaking, but also the emotional, spiritual realities as well. That much more, knowing of an institution like Remuda Ranch, I love the fact that they also integrate the Christian worldview as part of the therapy. They also have this really interesting aspect of animal therapy as well. When you become a client at Remuda Ranch, part of your stay there involves taking care of a horse. Why do you think that to be the case?
Horses have a very set diet, and they have to be exercised and have them.
And if you don't, what happens?
They die.
Yeah. Now understand what they're trying to do. They're trying to make a very specific connection, a very specific emotional connection between the client and the animal. And letting the client know, listen, how you treat this animal will either help it or hurt it. And you have a direct impact, and it will either hurt you emotionally or it will increase it. They're trying to make a very direct link between nutrition, between the way you treat this animal, and your relationship. They're essentially trying to then make that link into their own life. That what you see literally, and again, it's all done within very, very healthy ways. I mean, SPCA, I'm sure, is involved, that they're not like, letting these animals die. Well, now you learned your lesson, didn't you? No, they're not doing that kind of stuff, right? The animals are safe, okay? But the client gets to see a very direct means of caring for someone and the way that it's supposed to be, so as to apply that to their own life. And it's a very interesting. I have a friend of mine who's a therapist at Remuda Ranch, and they use this technique at a number of other eating clinics, non-Christian and Christian, because it's a very visceral means of learning how nutrition impacts a life. And they're supposed to learn that. That's one of the things they need to relearn in their life. And it's a very effective treatment. It's animal therapy in general, all right? The last one I gave you was, again, some referrals, some numbers and websites and things like that you can get some more information should you be interested. Questions, thoughts? Again, I can't reiterate enough how serious it is. If you start seeing these warning signs, to me, it's like right under suicide. You need to ask the question. You may be wrong, but I'd hate for you to be right and never ask the question. It's just that serious. But there is wonderful help available for these people as well. That's not just involving the individual, but is really holistic to the person's family as well. It really is something they need to consider on a very holistic level. And there is hope. I mean, there are women that I know within the family of Emmaus that have struggled with this in their past, and because of that, and finding freedom from it, are really able now to minister to other women that struggle with this. Almost every year I have young women who struggle with this issue, and wonderfully I'm able to refer them not only to a physician, not only to other clinics, but to women here within our community who have gone through that. I'll be honest, I can't empathize with that reality, but there are women who can, and to see their ministry now is a wonderful joy, to see how they can have a positive effect on other women who are going through this as well.